welcome to The Fine Print. This is David Grau Jr. welcoming you to a new episode format that we hope you enjoy. Historically, the Fine Print podcast has been hosted by me or one of the other experts here at Succession Resource Group, where we discuss and unpack specific topics, sometimes solo, other times with a guest who's either an expert on the topic or a fellow business owner who brings a unique perspective. This episode format we're launching is slightly different, which we've dubbed The Exchange. We have a lot of internal dialogue on various topics, as we've got a lot of smart people here with different skills and perspectives and areas of expertise. But that internal dialogue never gets shared, given it's, internal. So the exchange is our chance to give you as the audience a chance to ride shotgun with those conversations, to sit in as the most experienced team around M&A and succession for advisors goes deep on a topic. We're keeping this new format a bit more casual and conversational, which should help you find these sometimes dense subjects a bit more approachable, if not more actionable. With that, let's dive in.
Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the SRG Exchange. Today's topic will be entities, everything about entities, entity maintenance. We have our whole consulting team here today and our general counsel. Starting off with myself, my name is Nicole Fry. I am leading our entity and merger services here at SRG, and I'm going to have everyone here introduce themselves.
This is David Grau, president of Succession Resource Group. And I appreciate Nicole including me in the quote-unquote consulting team, although I don't actually get to do nearly as much consulting because we've got all the amazing people here joining us today.
Perfect. My name is Julia Sexton, and I lead our strategic organizational planning services. I'm here at SRG, which is a mouthful, but means I lead our contingency planning, equity sharing, and compensation design, as well as employment agreements service.
My name is Ryan Grau. I am the valuations director here at Succession Resource Group. I work with our clients on valuation and benchmarking and value building.
My name is Kristen Grau, and I lead our sell-side service.
Excellent. My name is Parker Fino. I run the transaction advisory services team here at SRG. So we focus on peer-to-peer acquisitions, internal succession planning, and buy-side acquisition support.
Hi, everyone. My name is Todd Folks. I'm general counsel here at SRG, and part of the legal team's role here is to help with all the contracts from all of these wonderful consultants, including the entity team.
Excellent. Very good to have you all here for today's discussion. I remember 10 years ago, as I started at SRG, the topic came up only every once in a while as we worked on succession plans, and equity sharing every once in a while came up already back then. Since then, these topics have morphed into something more of a strategic topic amongst advisors. So with that comes a lot of discussion on how you can share equity, how can you leverage your business in order to grow. So we have been dealing with entities for some time now, and I think advisors have started to realize that entities is not just something that attorneys set up for them, or maybe their accountant will recommend to them for tax savings purposes. But ultimately, an entity can really help you build your business in a way that promotes growth. It helps with employee retention and incentivization. Ultimately, entities comes up in all of your types of services. To start off our conversation, I just wanted to see what your view is on why entities have become much more popular in recent years, whether that's on the regulatory side, tax side, succession. What is your experience with that?
I'll jump in here. This is Ryan. One of the key things that we see from a value building perspective is employee retention, where an entity creates shares that are divisible, which allows you then to issue or use those shares to reward people, and as opposed to using straight base compensation, bonus compensation, that you have equity building in your business. But as a sole proprietor, you don't have any way to transition ownership or create incremental equity pathways in the business. By setting up and using a properly structured entity, you can create units, you can create stock that you can sell or gift or grant on a fractional basis. And as a result, it creates a shift in the mindset of anybody that holds those stocks. So even, phantom stock, which doesn't give you voting rights. It doesn't give you liquidation rights, but it does give you rights to the value in the company. So as a result, when you issue those shares, that mindset shifts from the work that I'm doing and getting paid for the work that I'm doing to how can I help increase the value of the company more so than just through what I'm doing. But if I go and I help somebody at work, I help them become better and more efficient at their role. I invest time into them. Well, they now help the company that's helping increase profitability, potentially increasing revenue, depending on what their role is. But it changes that mind shift from the work that I'm doing, the money that I'm bringing home, to I have something that is growing in value based on how the company is performing.
Yeah, and Ryan, so this is Todd, folks. I love that you mentioned the phantom equity too. That's something that we see a lot, and it's not necessarily the topic of today, but there's also a way we do a lot of work with people where we create pathways for them to be able to convert that phantom or synthetic equity into real equity. And it really is a behavioral trend. I love that you hit on that too. And Nicole, you said it as well. It incents behavior. If everybody's in the boat rowing the same way, they're going to make sure the lights are turned off at night. They're going to be watching the bottom line. And that's important for founders and owners. The other part that's important here is, Nicole, you touched on this too, just the regulatory conformity. We do a lot of work with entities. Some of that work is our clients coming to us and they've already had an entity set up, but it's been set up wrong. And so we help them reconstruct it, make it better. There are a ton of regulators. This is not surprising to anybody in this industry. So we're talking about the IRS, the SEC, for some people, state regulators. So it's important to get this right. And a lot of times we just don't see it when it comes in the door that's right.
What are some of the key issues there, Todd, that you are seeing? So you spoke of regulatory issues or nuances that they have to be aware of. What are some of those key issues that advisors should watch out for?
Yeah. So, and you see this, I think, probably more than anyone else, but when these are set up, it's usually set up by a CPA, local attorney, or they go to LegalZoom or something. But a lot of people, they set these entities up and then they get paid through their broker dealer. It's not as important for an independent RIA, but they just sweep that money into an operating account and there's no accountability for it. And there was a seminal case back in 2015 about this that really spoke to how to set or incongruent way to be able to put money into that entity and take it out. And I think that's very important. The last conference that I spoke at, actually somebody brought this up to me. And specifically the IRS, or the tax court rather, was looking at whether or not there was continuity between how the revenue flowed. And that's probably one of the things that is very important that you work on a daily basis, on how to make sure that we can get that into the entity in an efficient way, number one, but in as compliant of a way to mitigate that risk of the tax burden and audit as possible.
I know that when we were first talking about this conversation with entities at SRG, probably a decade ago at this point, it was you, Fry, and Dave, and myself. And we were looking at the Flesher case, which was kind of the start of all of this. And I think people were like, at least broker-dealer affiliated advisors were simply just, I can't have an entity. It doesn't work, right? And the Fleischer case is a good example of that because he had an entity and then he got in trouble by the IRS for having said entity and had to pay a lot of back taxes. And so the three of us at that time put our heads together and tried to come up with solutions that would work. And we've been doing that now for over a decade of, thinking outside the box, figuring out how can we make this happen? How can it work successfully? And then, others in the industry have followed suit. And I think Todd's spot on. If an advisor goes to LegalZoom or an attorney or a CPA, I think a lot of folks are like, oh, well, that's way cheaper for me. Sure, but your entity is it's going to be set up. It's just you can't use it in a way that's effective because you're also regulated by FINRA. And so we're able to kind of compare and contrast between the regulations that the IRS has and the regulations that FINRA has. And I think that that's so important because it does allow that growth aspect then.
Even tying back to your first question, Nicole, on sort of the importance of this stuff and why it's why we do so much of it now versus where we were as an industry, frankly, a decade ago. I feel like it did go from kind of this like administrative problem that we collectively had to solve, and we came up with some great solutions that we've been using now for a very long time, to being more almost about like the strategy. It's part of the business strategy, I feel like, at this point, where to do the equity sharing work that you do, Julia, to go buy a business, Parker, that you would work on, Nicole, mergers you work on, right? Like all of a sudden the entity went from this like foundational piece. I know I need to have it. It limits liability. I think it'll save me some taxes. And they would check it off. But I mean, cost was always a consideration, right? Because I have to get this boring administrative task done. And I got to deal with all these annoying regulators that Todd talked about. Let's get it done. Let's get it done as quickly and cost effectively as we possibly can, to where, I mean, but where I think the industry is now with so many bigger teams, next gen advisors coming on board, compensation evolving. You're shifting away from these like branch models to folks who have a lot of W-2 employees on payroll. Just all of a sudden, the entity has become not the forefront, right? Because it's still a foundational piece to the business. But it really has, in my mind, become part of the business strategy. And that was not the way things were a decade ago.
This is probably where Parker and Julia can chime in, because the entity has been used now for a lot of important business decisions that promotes growth. What do you see on your end? How do you deal with that, either on the sales side or then also on the employment side, anything equity sharing related?
Yeah. Thanks, Nicole. This is Parker jumping in here. So I was waiting for the right moment to jump in, but certainly succession planning, the entity usage is integral. As Todd alluded to earlier, there's obviously many advisors under corporate umbrellas, broker dealers, RIAs, et cetera, i.e., they're not their own standalone RIA. So in those instances, of course, there's the Fleischer case that you have to worry about from standing it up and setting it up correctly. But beyond that, to Dave's point, it really is a strategic tool to incentivize future owners, incentivize key personnel within the firm, which of course Julia can expand upon. But as far as internal succession and equity transfers are concerned, it's just critical. It provides a centralized unit of equity that we can transact within. It provides the basis for simplifying, banking, expense sharing, tax management. So a lot of great benefits there, but also just really enables us to have one defined pool of equity that we're transacting within, and evaluating the best way to transact and transition rather from the current generation of owners to the future generation of owners. So it is really critical. And, there are firms out there that are working under more of just a general partnership arrangement, was certainly possible. But in my opinion, the formality and the benefits from the legality of these entities is really beneficial, and it does create a really nice anchor to the succession planning process.
Yeah, as it does to the equity sharing consideration. So this is Julia. As I mentioned, I lead our equity sharing service. I'll just add in an additional layer to what everyone else mentioned in terms of benefits of having the structure of an entity and ultimately the organizational structure and abilities that it presents specifically when it comes to sharing equity as a value building exercise, as a retention exercise, reward, all of the above, depending on strategies that are considered in terms of what the owners or owner is willing to share in the form of equity. As Ryan mentioned earlier, there are various layers to that we would want to consider or have an owner consider. Are you willing to give up decision-making power and share voting rights? Are you willing to share profits of the business and share profit rights? Do you just want to share value in the company and therefore just liquidation rights? Or are you not yet ready to share, any of those in the form of true equity, but want to share compensation in the form of phantom equity? So all of those are various strategies that, we would present initially when someone even just first and foremost communicates they want to share equity. What do you mean by that? All of those decisions and strategies present different pathways that would be supported by different structures when it comes to entities and the options that are presented.
So with equity sharing, is that something that you can do with all employees, or is there specific criteria?
Yeah.
Yes. Again, another question, an early question in the thought process of I want to share equity. How do I share equity? Would be, what's your group of participants or employees that you are even considering in the first place sharing equity with? So that, first and foremost is a strategy in itself. Are there one or two individuals that really stand out on the team? Or do I want to create a form of additional compensation for retention perspective and possibly share something with all of my team members? Those are two separate paths that we can support with specific equity sharing plans. But, if you're wanting to share equity with potentially a large group of employees in your team, or we'll just assume all, there are specific options that you have where you wouldn't be able to explore other options, for example. So that's where we would spend a lot of time diving into sharing equity with everyone. We're ultimately talking about real equity where we would be limited under phantom equity consideration depending on the scope and size of the team.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to mention on the entity stuff, Todd, you touched on, FINRA. Kristen, you mentioned the Ryan Fleischer case from back in, what was that, 2015, I think?
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, when I hear, Julie, you talking about the equity sharing and different classes of ownership, I feel like when we started doing the entity related work, I mean, even frankly, before the Fleischer case, that was just a good moment to hit pause and make sure the strategies we were using still worked, given the feedback we had just seen from the IRS tax court. But it felt like it was a very administrative thing, right? Where we need to get the flow of funds figured out for folks who are governed by FINRA and under a broker dealer. And we did that. But over the years, the documents, I'll pick on you, Nicole, because you use these things day in and day out with Todd's support on getting them prepared. All of a sudden, the entity started to become more about, even for RIAs, right, where we don't have to deal with FINRA. We're not worried about the flow of funds. We direct bill with clients. The entity and the service and solution you guys provide still is mission critical, maybe more so than just dealing with the flow of funds because it is such a big part of the strategy, right? They got to think about multiple member classes, which brings us back. Should we be an LLC or an S-corp, or an LLC taxes an S-corp? There's just so much more that goes into it now. When I see the documents you guys,
Absolutely. And I think that's where we come in. And it's really important that we know the questions to ask to be able to help them figure out where they want to get to, what their goals are, what their priorities are. And David, to your point, this is something that shouldn't be cookie cutter. A lot of people make it cookie cutter. And you're right, we produce a lot of very, very specific documentation based on the goals and priorities of our clients. And we talked about S-corps. We haven't mentioned C-corps. It's rare that we see those. LLCs taxed as sole proprietors, disregarded entities, partnerships, S-corps, and all of this kind of comes together. There's a lot of different optionality. So what we really want to do is make sure that we're understanding what the client wants and delivering to them, number one, with the regulatory conformity and helping them mitigate those risks. But there's so many other benefits. I can talk about the legal side all day long because I dork out on that, obviously. But we talk about it's not just marketing, but that's part of it. It's being able to build, grow, set behavior, create long-term succession plans and contingency plans all together. So it's a multifaceted tool. It's like a Swiss Army knife. And David, you use the word foundational. I actually do see the entity as foundational, and it's a critical tool, and you have to make sure that it's set up right. If you don't, then you're going down a rabbit hole that you don't want to. And a lot of the work that Nicole does is pulling people back out of those rabbit holes and helping them get set up right. So David and Kristen, you guys both mentioned FINRA and the broker dealer and Flasher. So it's interesting. I came out of a large wealth management network, right? And we all at SRG and for most of our careers have worked with broker dealers, wealth management firms, RIAs, obviously. So we worked with a lot of practice management folks who are at the wealth management firm, and they're working with the advisors, the financial professionals on a number of different things, but it also includes succession planning. And this is something that we've been in meetings about, industry meetings with a lot of these practice management folks. And I've thrown out the question, David, you and I were at one, and you heard me, hey, raise your hand if your advisors are asking you about entities. Everybody raised their hand. So it's something that they get asked for. And these are all the practice management folks at all of these firms are great. They have very high acumen. We work very well with them. but both they and we know their limitations on the knowledge base that they have in this area. And I would also include that anybody at a broker dealer is going to be reluctant to help you set this up. I know in my case, we were, because it's technically an outside business activity. And it's something that the broker dealer, the wealth management firm really doesn't want to touch.
Well, it's funny you said it shouldn't be cookie cutter. I mean, I'll play the devil's advocate role because I think you guys know where this will end up going, and I'll deliver the mic back to you anyway, Nicole. If I'm a solo advisor, I've got my own independent RIA, for example, or under a BD, doesn't really matter, but it's just me, a couple staff members. I just go set the LLC or the S-corp up, right? Just myself. I'm just going to run some expenses through it, but I know I should have it, try to save some taxes. But then they start to have some wins, right? They start growing, they buy a business, they grow organically. I mean, it'd be fantastic, right? And all of a sudden they get to, a couple $100 million in AUM, the team's bigger now, and they have the same kind of rudimentary cookie cutter structure that worked, right? And they got it sort of off the shelf. And it's not that you can't come in, Nicole, right in as the white knight and bring new governance documents and redo things. But the problem is, oftentimes, the structure they picked 10 years ago was fine in the moment, right? And the cookie cutter solution did work, but it doesn't work now. And all of a sudden you have to sort of break the mold and almost start over, which, when you've got employee benefits and I don't know, it gets really hard, right? You got your lease signed through the company, but it turns out now they're talking to Nicole and she's the wet blanket here telling them, well, what got you here won't get you there for what you want to do going forward, right? I think about some of your merger projects you work on, like, well, if you had the right entity structure, everything else you'd be doing here would be so much easier. So I feel like you spend a lot of time, Nicole, going back and fixing things that if they had strategically thought about it a decade ago, they probably wouldn't have picked the entity that they're using now. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I think key is that advisors who usually have that entity set up is because of the recommendation of their CPA or an attorney. And that is based on short-term goals. It's either you need something for liability protection or let's focus on some tax savings that you can leverage. And as they then grow the business, they start utilizing that entity maybe in ways that gets them locked in, meaning unraveling that whole system might require, really some creative solutions here. So this is what we have to look into at that point. The mergers, for example, they can be pretty complex depending on what entity setup advisors have. So when we start the conversation, we always focus not just on short-term goals, but I always want to make sure we also understand what do you want to do potentially in the future. So we don't set something up that is difficult to implement or utilize in the future. So this is where we have a lot of conversations about the S corporations. Their reputation has tarnished a little bit in the last couple of years just because they come with a lot of restrictions. So we'll talk about that. Is the S Corp still a good fit? In certain scenarios, yes. Parker mentioned succession planning where people utilize an entity more for internal growth to have successor owners come on board. The S Corp can still be a good tool for that. However, for most folks, if they look into growth through mergers where they add other partners who seem to be a good fit culturally and based on their skill level and expertise, the LLC tax as a partnership has become a very popular tool for that because it provides a lot of flexibility. So we do talk about all of this. We go into detail about how should the entity be taxed? How do you want to manage the company? Do you want different ownership classes? So all of that is included in our program just so that the advisor doesn't end up with something that ultimately provides more challenges down the road versus solutions.
Yeah, and
And
Nicole, I would just jump in and echo that. And I think that's one of the geniuses that you have is being able to understand what our clients' goals are and helping them structure something that works for them. I generically say all the time that the benefit of an S corporation is its rigidity, and the drawback of an S corporation is its rigidity. The benefit of an LLC taxed as a partnership is its flexibility. The drawback is its flexibility. So having someone like you to be able to walk them through their specific situation and help them set that up properly for them, I think is profound, quite frankly.
Yeah, and I want to
So
jump in here as well to echo from the succession planning perspective, just a little bit of the logistics of what it is that we do here. One of the most difficult transitions is going from one owner to more than one owner. If you're going from 3 to 5, 5 to 10, not going to be as impactful. But of course, there's a lot of these, solo owned businesses that eventually are expanding that ownership pool. And so one of the logistical pieces that I think we and Nicole do really well here is that interactive planning with you. So that's taking current founder, future owners, and understanding, well, what are the goals, synchronizing that with the long-term succession planning and or the unique facets of the succession planning that me and my team are overseeing, and designing a structure, but not only just structure, just the underlying terms, the buy sell terms, the voting provisions, things like drag along and tag along rights. What certainty do I have around my investment in the firm? Do I buy in and then tomorrow I'm forced to sell my stake? Well, there's a lot of questions like that that need to be worked through dynamically. And that's where Nicole and team, of course, help merge our different goals and considerations into that one finalized output.
And I'll pile on with respect to the going from one to more than one on the succession side, Parker, to your point. Planning for succession is hard enough, right? I mean, finding the folks, training them up, mentoring them, creating the compensation so that they stay, creating the career tracks. And then, Parker, you've got to help create the timeline, the financing, the taxes. And then on top of it, we need to be starting to think about, all right, well, we had one owner, now we have 2 or 5. It doesn't really matter, right? It's 1 plus. Now we have something about voting and decision-making and types of equity. So Parker and Nicole, as you think about the timing and order of operations for folks thinking about succession planning, and that would be going from one owner to more than one, would you recommend they do their entity work first or start the succession work first and then revisit the entity once we have an idea of the solution?
I definitely have a preference there. Hopefully that aligns, Parker, with yours. So obviously, when it comes to setting up the entity, we need to have some initial idea in terms of how is ownership shared, because a lot of the questions will be around how do we manage this? Founders sometimes are worried about giving up too much control right away. So we need to kind of have an idea, what do they envision in terms of a transition plan? And then we can then jump in and fill in all of the blanks and answer all of those questions. Once they know how much in terms of equity they want to share initially and then over the coming years. And then we'll work through things like ownership classes. Should your successor have voting rights right away, or are they not ready for that? Maybe they'll start out with non voting units or shares. And then as they gain more experience and the founder has been able to mentor them in terms of ownership questions and all of that, then they can convert those non-voting units to voting units. And then, we'll work through voting requirements. At what point do they have an actual say? Even though they might have a seat at the table, they don't always have voting power because of the percentage they hold. And so that is all something that we'll work through. But usually we need some sort of idea in terms of that transition plan. Also, what always comes up is, what is it that you're selling? Is that an interest in a book of business? Is that an interest in an entity because it's already set up to hold your business value? So those things we'll always work through. Parker and I connect a lot on those topics just to make sure everyone is set up right for that transition plan.
Yeah, I'm just chuckling, waiting to chime in and kind of reiterate every single thing you just said. We are 100% aligned. I would say that you definitely want to have a general sense of what you're doing from a succession planning perspective, either the most immediate steps or the longer term steps. I will also say this applies to folks that have a business entity in place already, don't have a business entity in place already. This again goes back to the succession planning work of where are we right now? What are the goals of the different interested parties? And what are the strategies available to us to get there? So to Nicole's point, that even includes something as basic as what are we buying and selling, and or what limitations might we have based on the entity that's in place. I've got succession clients right now who have gone and made some strategic entity structuring and tax status decisions based on various guidance. Now we're working through succession planning, having major hurdles, looking at really advanced reorganizations that they're considering. And even those are generally not looking to be viable options. So that's where it's really helpful to have longer term goals in mind, right? Are you eventually going to transition the firm internally? Or are you really dedicated to an external sale, right? These are two different things. And then to Nicole's point, Let's have an understanding of where we're starting, what the immediate next steps are, and then what the long-term vision is. And she's going to help you structure something to really address that strategy.
I think ultimately, with Entity, a lot of people, clients of ours, are like, gosh, why do I need this? Right? I just want a succession plan or I just want an equity sharing. And I think so much the devil is in the details. It's yes, you do want that, but we're trying to help you understand all of the questions you didn't know you needed to ask to create the ultimate structure that will help you not only meet your immediate goal of, let's say, a succession plan or an equity sharing event, or maybe even an evaluation, but it's okay, how do I improve my value? How do I share said equity? And a lot of times that is through an entity. Our sales team, Nicole Sinclair, does a great job of really trying to answer all of these questions and get those things nailed down. Like, okay, so you're saying you want a succession plan. Tell me a little bit more about that. Okay, well, then you might get an engagement agreement that is a succession plan and an entity and an evaluation. Well, it's because all of those things work strategically together to help you create the goal, not just the end product, but the product that is good today and good tomorrow and good 10 years from now, not just a band aid.
And we occasionally
And
get clients, right, we had one recently. He shall remain nameless, but I think he listens to the podcast and I think he'll know who we're talking about. Where when he left the wirehouse, brought over a good book of business, and I think had his brother come and join forces with him. He was very intentional with us on the front end before doing any of the other work, right? Here's all the things I want to try to accomplish as I grow my firm. I'm going to buy practices. I'm going to merge practices. I'm going to have tuck-ins. I'm going to have a lot of employees. He went down the list and all of a sudden that helps inform your recommendations, Nicole, right? Like you're not just going to tell them, hey, here's the standard answer that I'd give everybody else because, I mean, I don't want to say size matters, right? But your goals as an organization can certainly inform it. And I would guess, Nicole, if you had somebody like that, as opposed to a 55-year-old advisor who's built a great lifestyle practice, but they don't have any lofty growth ambitions, right? Like they just want to maintain status quo. I want to save a little money in taxes, maybe reduce my liability. Like you're going to give different answers there on their structure, right?
Absolutely. We don't believe in cookie cutter solutions, so that's why we do talk about what is it that you want to do with your business. And I just want to say for those sole proprietors, the entity is still a must in my book. So they should still consider setting up an entity. And maybe this is when I sound like a lawyer or a CPA because you can still provide for liability protection, which is important, and then you can also look into certain tax savings. It just needs to be done the right way. We need to think about the regulatory issues here. Anybody affiliated with a broker dealer, how do we get the revenue into an entity? And then also the IRS. So we need to make sure this is set up properly. There's a legitimate business purpose there. You can show this is not set up just for tax avoidance purposes. So we work through all of this. But then obviously someone who wants to set up an entity to grow by recruiting other people, by offering equity sharing plans to employees, and like what Julia is doing with our clients, the structure might look a little different. So we do look at that. There's no easy button. I do always tell clients, we want you to understand what you're setting up and why and how it works. So we have a pretty rigorous program to work through all of these questions. We have plenty of resources to help them understand. We always love to bring on the CPA so that they have support from a tax standpoint too. That way they're not, ending up with an entity and we say, here you go. And they're stuck, operating this on their own and they don't know how. So it's important to have your professionals help you with that. And we love to work with them to help facilitate that.
Yeah.
And
Real
Dave,
quick.
I know that you have been working with a pretty large group who hired a industry attorney, at 450,
Mhm.
550 an hour.
900.
Okay, 900 an hour, who touted that they could create an entity, do all of the things, and not only were the legal agreements fairly subpar, excluded attachments or exhibits full-on signatures of people's legal ownership, but just we've been spending months at this point really unwinding that particular entity to try to make it actually work. There was language in there that just wasn't applicable or contrary to the industry that they were in. I think that it just bears repeating. This is our service is not just setting up an entity, but
Right.
it's setting up an entity that we know will work for the future. And so, even if you go to an attorney, that oftentimes is not going to be the right solution for you. And I think that case study, Dave, you've been working on it most closely. I think you could speak more eloquently about that, but I think that's like a very strong case as to why people come to us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It was the firm will remain nameless, but it's a well-known East Coast law firm that specializes in this industry. And again, I won't throw, unnecessary shade towards them, A, for effort. By page count and word count, I mean, they nailed it. I mean, I can only imagine the amount of billable time that was generated to produce this document. The problem is we've used that term cookie cutter, I feel like kind of in a derogatory way a couple of times. Here, we lean into the cookie cutter. Like, I'm not going to hide from it. We have form contracts, lots of them. We got lots of different cookie cutters here, and they're amazing. They're the most intricate cookie cutters you have ever seen. And the nice thing is, Nicole, you use those things over and over and over again, and they get polished and they get evolved and they grow. As a client, I mean, I don't want this to be like a sales call in episode, but when you think about it as a client, who should I hire to do an entity? My first thought would be an attorney as well, right? If I need my taxes filed, I'm going to call a CPA. If I need a contract generated, I'm calling the attorney. Don't do that. I don't care if you call one of our peers or competitors. The attorneys are great at reviewing, and they're great at writing things down that you know to ask for. But again, you as the client, business strategy-wise, know what to ask for, but they need a lot more specificity. Well, Nicole, when you're talking to these folks and finding out what they need, again, you're not going to go start with a blank sheet of paper working with Todd and start drafting. You're going to go lean into something that's 90% of what they need. Because most of the time, you guys end up delivering sort of a Ferrari to these clients of governance documents. And they probably only needed a Honda. But I'd rather that they have all these bells and whistles and features, and it's the last thing I'll say, and I'll get off my soapbox, is I think the industry would be a lot further along on succession, equity sharing, and next-gen advancement if we had done a better job 10, 20 years ago of figuring out multiple classes of ownership in ways that when I see Julia, you doing equity sharing, I don't want to say their eyes light up, right? But the advisors are a lot more interested in sharing equity when they know it's not just a one size fits all, right? Like, it's the equity that I have that has voting rights and profit rights and valuation rights. Like, well, what do you mean there could be other options that start to peel those layers away? Like, that I would be interested in. Or even going real parallel and doing a phantom equity sharing plan. Like, 10 years ago, I could count on one hand the number of phantom equity or synthetic equity plans we did. Julia, I would need my hands and toes to count the number of equity sharing plans you have going right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can echo, what Parker and Kristen mentioned earlier in terms of, the entities really being foundational. That's where conversations start with equity sharing as well. It doesn't mean you can't share equity at all or some form of equity strategy if you don't have an entity or a recently reviewed entity, but it's probably, as we've all just talked about for 30 minutes, not going to solve the long-term goals as efficiently as it could. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario, as Parker and Nicole Fry alluded to, in terms of, succession planning or fill in the blank equity sharing. It makes sense to begin discussing strategy, but at some point we, have to hit pause or work at the same time through what are the strategies on the entity side to make sure what you have is either sufficient, or if we need to start thinking about a broader list of questions as it relates to your entity than you were asking yourself 10 years ago when you initially set this up, when we start talking about sharing equity in the form of succession planning and a retirement plan, or equity sharing from the perspective of retention reward with your key employees.
Yeah, and actually, we've talked a good bit about succession planning and internal equity sharing, which is really an important piece of this industry based on the trends and consolidation and ensemble building, et cetera. But I also wanted to highlight that this is not only for succession planning or equity, it's also for peer-to-peer acquisitions, for mergers, for equity
Mhm.
swaps. I can think of an arm's length transaction that I intermediated not long ago, where again, another industry lawyer slash consultant who had stood up the entity agreements, trying to help the clients determine the most tax advantageous structure to effect the partner buyout. And realistically, I came up with maybe 8 to 10 different conflicts within their stack of agreements. They could point one way or the other. So it starts to get relatively subjective and ultimately caused complications. They went with a structure that did not produce as many favorable tax outcomes, being that they were not confident based on the structure that was in place that they had the ability to use that alternate strategy. I'll also say, Nicole can attest to this. We've seen some sizable mergers, right? When we're talking about two firms, two organizations merging, not just, hey, I'm merging because one other party and me, we're going to combine our books, right? We've seen complications on that end. And then lastly, just those equity swaps, like I was mentioning, I get transaction support engagements where we've got a sort of an advisor on an island. They want to join into the mothership. And based on the structure of the mothership, that could complicate or lessen some of the strategies available. So I wanted to highlight as well, it's not just succession or equity sharing as well.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point. We see that all the time on sell side representation too. I think that the other component to this is an entity isn't just a one time set it and forget it. You also need to keep up on maintaining it and making sure that you're not gonna cause the entity to then be null and void down the road. And, that's another service, to be honest, that we offer is the entity maintenance program. But it's really just making sure that you're doing your minutes, that you're documenting, that you are accounting for any sort of changes. But I also think it enhances the value of your practice, which I'm sure Ryan can speak to. It's making sure that you're treating this financial services business as an actual business, not just this thing that produces and kicks off revenue.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've done evaluation, and when they send their corporate governance documents, I'm like, wait a minute, you said that there are 6 owners here, but there's only 2 listed in your LLC operating agreement. They're like, oh yeah, that was done years ago. So just a quick topic for the group here on document maintenance. So because I see this again a lot where documents are not maintained, they're not kept up. What does maintenance look like? How frequently should documents be updated? And then, the key thing that I think a lot of people don't even know to ask is, when I admit a new partner, when I bring on a new partner, what is that process for adding them to those documents? Do we have to go scrap our previous documents? Do we have to have all new ones built? So what are the solutions on those topics?
All great points. So the maintenance is definitely important. Making sure that your documents reflect your ownership positions or division. That is absolutely important because you need to capture in writing at what point did you add another owner that affects their rights and responsibilities. So if we talk about adding another owner, usually you would have some sort of transaction document. How did they become an owner? Parker mentioned a few ways. They would swap their equity in a book in exchange for equity in an entity, for example, or they would buy in, or under Julia's program, they might get an equity grant. So you would have some sort of transaction document. And then in your entity documents, you would then capture who is the owner, when did they become an owner, how did they become an owner. So that should all be in those documents. Usually there are some sort of schedules or tables or ledgers that should reflect that. Our program can handle that, so that's easily done. The one thing that advisors might want to take a look at more closely, because those updates are easy, but the other question is, are your documents still relevant now that your ownership division shifted? Taking a look at your voting requirements, making sure you're still comfortable with that. Some people have certain cross purchase arrangements where they designate a particular partner to buy their interests. So that might be important too to take a look at. So it's good to just get in the habit of reviewing your documents once a year if something significantly changed. If anything else, just in your regular operations, you still would want to capture those important decisions in writing. As I mentioned, the minutes, things like distributions, hiring key people, if you moved your office. So those things you should capture in writing. I always tell clients, even though you have an LLC and technically there's no legal requirement, it is really important to help with liability protection because you're authorizing the entity to take certain actions. It also helps avoid partnership disputes. Sometimes our memory doesn't serve us best and we don't remember that we did something or we have some misunderstandings. And actually capturing things in writing that we then have to sign will help solidify our decision and we create a record. So it is definitely good to have that in place.
And to Ryan's point, right, we're getting documents that don't show the current owners. I've even had deals show up and they're like, we genuinely cannot find the signed versions of these agreements, so we'd have to go, replace them from years prior. And a lot of times, what happens is you've got deals. Right. We're looking to get a deal done. We've been thinking about it, planning on it for a long time. A few months or a couple months before the deal, we're going to engage SRG and we're deep in the process with lending. Suddenly we realize our entity agreements are not fully up to date. They're not, up to code. And the lender is 100% going to require these things to be in good order in time to fund this transaction. So it's another piece where, again, our specific entity maintenance program alone can help you keep everything in order outside of just those requirements as well to maintain the entity.
Well,
Yeah.
we all know lenders, right? Like I don't say they're looking for an excuse to push the timeline out, but especially this time of year, they're super busy. So don't give them a reason to push your file out and maybe miss your closing date.
Well, I think so often, again, people just like take the entity, establish it, and then to, everyone's point, you just kind of put it up on the shelf maybe and let it collect dust. And the problem with that is then it's not an issue until it becomes an issue, right? Until you actually need that entity for something, which it could just be as simple maybe as getting a loan, but oftentimes it's for something significantly more than that, and it's usually for a dispute, right? An owner dispute, maybe a client or an employee dispute, and if your entity documents are not up to date, like that's going to be the first thing that's submitted into evidence in some sort of legal disagreement, and whether that's FINRA arbitration or whether that is in a court system. That's a pretty immediate way for your case to be dismissed or you lose. And it's pretty stupid when it's something very simple that you can just have automatically, updated on a regular basis and make sure that it's done right. Because again, even if you just submit documents with the state on an annual basis, which is often required in a lot of states, but you change the title of someone, well, then they're probably going to ask you, why did you change the title? They went from member to president or something ridiculous. And it's like, oh, well, just because I forgot that I put member last year and they're the president this year. Well, those little things make a big difference and could cause further issues down the road.
Yeah, and Kristen, I'll dovetail on that on the legal front. So I'm a FINRA arbitrator, and you're 100% accurate. All of those things come into evidence, and maintenance is key. We've used the term cookie cutter a lot here. I think my favorite term that we've used here today is strategic. And I think if our clients are thinking strategically, which they should be, tactically around the fringes, but this is a bigger concept to be able to put together. It's very foundational. And we've talked about attorneys, David, a little bit. We run into and work with attorneys and CPAs on a regular basis. And they're great business attorneys, but they just don't know our industry. And to your point, if you find an attorney who does know our industry, you're paying $900, $1,200 an hour for that work. And I know the document you're talking about, I think it was 80 to 100 pages.
Yeah, you just had to look at it.
I decided not to read the entire thing. I did not have enough wine to do that. So a lot of them are, they don't understand our industry. Attorneys are taught to be transactional. There are a lot of nuances here. There's a lot going on with this. It's not just setting up an entity. There are a lot of other strategic thoughts that you have to think through. And one of the things I love about our services here is the team approach that we take and to be able to coordinate and choreograph between the different teams. And I think what Parker and Nicole and Julia were all talking about, and Ryan, is how we all work with that connectivity to put these together. So I think that's one of the favorite things that I really love about SRG is the team, the coordination between the teams here.
Well, it's funny, valuation used to be, and it probably is still, right? It's like the initial entry point for so much of the work that we do. But I feel like now it's valuation and then probably entity is like the next pit stop on the road that almost all of our clients need, right? If they're going to do equity sharing with you, Julia, they probably need an entity or at least get it redone so that I have governance documents that I would not be embarrassed to show somebody or that I can actually go find, because that's happened to the best of us. Employment contracts, again, back to you, Julia. I cannot imagine a growing firm having employees and the owner employing them personally, like under their personal tax ID. Like that just sounds terrifying to me as a fellow business owner. So it sounds like the next step of the work that I feel like almost every advisor should be doing. But it is about finding a balance, because Todd, you used the example of that pile of documents from that attorney we referenced earlier that was, I mean, it was at least 80, 90 pages. I mean, it might have been longer. And there was no cover page. Like this was literally just pure legalese. Some of the paragraphs were whole pages, which you think, okay, well, that's fine. It's fine, but it's about finding a balance, right? I've seen operating agreements, and I know you have as well. I mean, all of you here today, that are 6 or 7 pages, right? It's super easy to understand. The client loves it, but it would not do them an ounce of good when there's an issue that comes up. So little issues become big issues. But you can go the other end of the spectrum, right? Where you need a table of contents because the darn thing is so long. And the problem there is the client we're talking about in this example, I can tell you categorically, they have not read the whole thing. Even if they did, they wouldn't understand it. Because the problem is that attorneys that do that kind of work aren't drafting the document to be usable by the client.
Yeah.
They're writing it for their attorneys, right?
I I think I'll just kind of piggyback on that. I know, Fry, you just completed a pretty large merger, and the folks that came to us, all clients, they're like, "Oh, I have everything figured out. We're ready to go. I've consulted with a CPA, I've consulted with an attorney." And then we ask like one question, like, "Okay, tell us about it. Tell us what you're trying to accomplish. Tell us what your goal is." And the more they talk, the more we're like, "Okay, then that doesn't work, and that doesn't work, and that doesn't work, and this is why." And then they're like, "But I already ran this by my attorney. I already ran this by my CPA." And we're like, "Yeah, but, I think what ends up happening is so often advisors, right, business owners, they're thinking of one thing. I'm trying to get from point A to point B. And because of that, then the CPAs try to solve for point B. The attorneys try and solve for point B. They're thinking in it in such an isolated manner that then they miss all of the in-betweens. And it's really not an A to B, it's an A to Z. And so, yes, there are certain strategies that can be implemented, but maybe to solve tax, mitigation strategies, we need to go from A to F to G to Q. It's just so much more complex. And I think, when you try to provide these solutions and save a couple bucks, you really end up spending quite a bit more in the long run, rather than if you just came to us on the onset.
Had some great insights here. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing all these valuable thoughts and ideas. The key takeaways here are everyone should have an entity. Whether you're a sole proprietor or you operate as a team, you should have an entity. However, that entity setup should be based on full information, and the discussion should always start with what are your goals, not just in the short term, but also in the long term. Have us help you create a strategy that works for years and years to come, that you're comfortable with, that you also understand, meaning you will not have a 100-page operating agreement because you actually need to operate the entity under that agreement. So that means you should understand what you've signed off on. So let us help you with that, and let us help you work with your other professionals. So if you bring on the CPA, which I always love to invite, also your attorneys, there is a point in time when their help is very useful in this process. But let us help you understand what it is that you can do based on the goals that you want, and then we can facilitate everything else. That way you have something set up for the long term.
And that concludes another episode of The Fine Print from SRG. We hope you found this episode both interesting and valuable. We encourage you to check out our website at www.successionresource.com. And of course, connect with us on social media for the latest happenings here at SRG. If If you just can't get enough of the fine print, we invite you to join our monthly webinar series and newsletters where we address many of the topics covered in this podcast in greater detail. Finally, if you enjoyed today's episode as much as we did recording it, please leave us a review, a good one, mind you, and tell your industry friends about us. Your support helps us continue to bring you the best content possible. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests or individual hosts and not necessarily the views or opinions of Succession Resource Group. Content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, as amazing it might be. Always seek the advice of an expert with any questions you may have. As always, we at SRG stand ready to help when you're ready.